Welcome, everybody. I'm Will, your Finimize community host for today, and welcome back to the Modern Investor Summit, where I have two very special guests in front of me. Kristin Smith, who is the Executive Director at the Blockchain Association, and Susan Friedman, who's the Head of Public Policy over at Ripple. If you guys could just start introducing yourselves in the chat, let me know your name, where you're from, and there will be a poll that pops up. Michelle, if you could start the poll for us. And then go ahead and answer those questions. And just so you guys know, typical structure, 30 minutes of discussion followed by 15 minutes of audience Q&A. And don't forget to ask your questions in the Q&A box. It is sometimes hard to follow the chat, so if you put it in the chat, I do not want an excellent question to get lost. So please drop them in the Q&A box. I'll do a reminder about halfway through the session as well. And just a reminder as well, best question, get some merch. And we're giving away a Finimize yearly subscription. Without further ado, I just want to dive directly into the first question. Kristin, with the recent FTX fallout, there's been a lot of focus on crypto regulation. And I would like to kind of understand from a regulation perspective, what could have been done to prevent this from happening?
Yeah, no, and Will, thanks for having me here today. Excited to have this conversation. I think the important thing to remember about FTX International is that whatever jurisdiction they're operating in, wherever those customers are, they need to be licensed to serve those customers. And so, if you're in the US or you're in the UK, you probably weren't impacted by the fallout from FTX as you would be if you were living in the Bahamas or some of the other jurisdictions that they operated in. The interesting thing about the regulatory perspective is there was a lot that FTX was doing that appears to already be probably illegal where they were at, but also probably violating their own terms of service. When you gave money as a customer to FTX and purchased crypto assets with those funds, they were supposed to be holding those assets on your behalf. Instead, what FTX was doing was taking those, handing them over to their sister entity Alameda and making sort of risky derivatives bets with those funds. And so that in and of itself is a highly unusual practice. Now, there are regulations that could probably prevent or at least help us detect behavior like this earlier on, right? Like in the US, even today, without a complete regulatory structure in the US, if you are a crypto exchange, you have money transmitter licenses, and it's very clear that you, A, can't lie to your customers about what you're doing with their funds, but B, you're supposed to be holding those funds safely on their behalf. And in order to prove that, there are audit requirements that US exchanges have to do with state regulators. And there's some steps and some sort of checks and balances along the way that would prevent this level of sort of malfeasance from happening if they were registered in the US. And so I think the big question is what can we do to better harmonize international regulations? What can, I sit here in the United States, what can we be doing in the United States to make it more attractive for companies to have more robust operations here in the US? But, the reality is what FTX did, was already hugely problematic and something that isn't allowed in most places. It's definitely a violation of their own terms of service. And so what we need to do is figure out how to have the appropriate level of insight in order to catch these types of things when they happen. But the good news is I don't think this is how most crypto exchanges operate, and most of them, are I think have much better practices in place than we saw with FTX International.
Yeah, thank you for taking that question. Susan, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, Will, thanks first of all for having us here today. I think I agree with what Kristin said. What I would add on top of that is just yesterday, there was a US company, Nexo, that announced it was leaving the US because of lack of regulatory clarity. And I think what happens, it's not just that countries lose innovation when there isn't a regulatory framework in place, but they lose that oversight capacity, and companies go to jurisdictions which may not have as robust frameworks in place. I think the point that Kristin made about the need for international frameworks, not just to be harmonized, but in many jurisdictions just to be put in place, is a necessary first step so that you eliminate that possibility of regulatory arbitrage. And there are great examples of frameworks that have been established that can now be drawn on for best practices. They include Singapore, they include Japan. The EU just passed MiCA, which will be going into effect likely in 2024. There are examples out there. We are long past the point where there is nothing to draw from. It's now a question of bringing all countries up to that same benchmark, not to have identical standards, but to have that baseline set of oversight, which I do think would help prevent situations like FTX from happening in the first instance.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding what you both said correctly, it sounds like there are regulation ideas for us to pull from. It's just a matter of there still being some countries that are laggers. So we're exploiting those areas. And that's kind of where the fallout might have taken place. Perfect.
There are definitely gaps in the safety net. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So Susan, you mentioned that regulation typically slows down innovation, and that's definitely true. If you look at an industry like the banking, for example, they have so much regulation and are very slow to move. So I'm curious, do you think that there's an argument that would be less regulation to kind of allow for the speed of crypto's innovation to continue at the pace that it's going?
Thanks. I think I was actually making a slightly different point, which is that lack of regulatory clarity is what causes industries' innovation to leave certain jurisdictions, which is a loss to, it's a loss to the US, it's a loss to whatever countries are having industries that are leaving, whether it's from lack of regulatory clarity or because regulators are being slow to implement the regulations that are in place. I think what actually is going to be a huge driver for the industry is clear frameworks that are enacted globally, because the problem that you have, using the US as an example, is that when a company sets up here, they don't know who is going to be overseeing them. There are at least 8 different regulatory agencies that were cited in a Department of Justice report that have oversight over crypto. And the problem is that you just don't know which one is going to come in at any point to bring the hammer down, potentially, depending on what you're doing, even when you are trying to enact, to follow what you, to stay within the lines of the regulatory framework. So I actually think in this instance, I think in this instance that what is really going to be a driver for crypto and for innovation to grow in the US and globally is the establishment of clear frameworks, clear guidelines, where players know who they're reporting to, how they're going to be governed, who are the relevant authorities. MiCA is a good example of this. It's a single rule book for the entire EU. And that's the kind of, I think, development that will cause industry to flourish ultimately.
Okay. So you're saying...
Yeah, and I would... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just trying to clarify to make sure I understood correctly, is that you're saying that within pretty much like giving some walls to the crypto environment is kind of where we're going to see some flourishing and some proper innovation, because right now it's kind of a guessing game.
Guidelines for clear guidelines, clear signposts of how different projects are going to be regulated. Both within the US, I think, is a good example of just the lack of clarity. And you see this with Congress debating the various proposals about how digital asset spot markets should be regulated, but also globally. There are jurisdictions like the UK that I think are making good progress, but haven't enacted that holistic framework for industry yet.
Yep. Kristin, you had something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think that I agree with everything Sue said. Like, if done properly, framework with guidance on how these assets are going to be regulated can be very good for innovation. I do think the devil's in the details, though, because if the clarity we get is you can't do this at all, that's not like helpful, right? Like that's an example of the regulation holding the innovation back. But if done correctly, it can enable that innovation to be done in a way that is safe, that where consumers are protected, where there's disclosure around the investment. And so I think the devil's in the details, but I largely agree that if done correctly, we can put frameworks in place that people can comply with, that shouldn't stifle innovation, but should help it. But the devil's always in the details.
Yeah. Susan, would you mind kind of giving a specific example of regulation that could be seen as a net positive for kind of the technology moving forward, but also consumers as a whole?
Yeah, I think the EU's MiCA, the markets and crypto asset regulation that they just passed, is a great example of what good regulation could look like. To Kristin's point, the devil's in the details. There are points of MiCA that still need to be hammered out, and there are people who may disagree with certain aspects of it. But what it does for the EU is to tell, particularly with respect to centralized actors, here is how you are going to operate. Here's when a white paper about a token is going to be issued. Here are the authorities who are going to supervise you. Here are the amount of reserves you have to have. Here are the disclosures you need to make and what you need to have in reserves. If FTX had been registered in the EU, the sort of fallout that we saw would not have occurred. I think that is the main point. It is about that clarity and understanding what the rules of the road are in the jurisdiction in which you're operating.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And then just kind of going off of that a little bit more with the talk of regulation and kind of different locations, do you think that there's any crypto projects that with the introduction of more regulation might have seen some like positive benefit or some negative drawbacks from some additional regulation?
I mean, I can take that one. I actually think the crypto projects that would be most impacted by regulation are the ones we haven't seen yet. I think certainly clarity would benefit existing projects. Particularly in the US, we see a lot of regulation by enforcement, which is certainly not an ideal way to make policy, but we have different actors in the space, including Ripple, who've done a really good job, pushing back against that, because, the regulators only have so much authority, and what they really probably need is some guidance from Congress to help, clear things up going forward. But absent that guidance, they will use the courts to try to test where those limits lie, and that is not like the most productive, best way to make policy. But unfortunately, it's often the way it's done here in the US. So I think it would certainly provide a lot of clarity for existing participants. But I think it's like those projects that either don't launch because they don't have a clear pathway forward, or they try to go to a company a jurisdiction overseas and maybe experiment there where they don't have access to a broader marketplace. Like, those are the ones that could probably benefit the most from having a sound regulatory framework here in the US. So I think it could, again, if done correctly, lead to a whole new wave of innovation that, would help build out all of the different infrastructure within the industry, and also lead to new ideas coming online.
Perfect.
I would also say too, from the investor perspective, I think particularly with institutional investors, that there's some hesitancy for them to invest in different crypto assets because they have concerns around regulation. Like there's often concerns around the marketplaces themselves for trading these assets, but also whether this is something that they should be getting exposure to, or whether or not the laws are clear enough for them to feel like they can, pass those kind of opportunities on to their customers. So, I think that clear regulation could be good, from kind of the institutional investor perspective too, who want to get more into this space.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point as well. Kind of driving some of their assets, and they'd like to see some additional regulation. And this is the point where we're trying to transition into reading questions from the Q&A. So if you have a question, I see a bunch of them already in here. Feel free to go ahead and leave it in the Q&A box. So I think one question that we would like to tackle is from the Mandeep, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Are regulation frameworks on crypto and true decentralization mutually exclusive?
I think that's a very interesting question. And this is a debate that I think the industry, at least within the US, has been having. I think it's important to remember that there are different types of actors in the crypto ecosystem. There are centralized platforms that help people trade in and out of fiat into different kinds of cryptocurrencies. There are other centralized platforms that help users custody their assets because they don't want to do that sort of custody themselves. I think when we're looking at those kind of custodial intermediaries, it's very appropriate to have regulatory frameworks there. But that doesn't always work for everyone else in the ecosystem, right? Like you have projects where maybe it makes sense to have some disclosures, but it might not make sense for those disclosures to look like something we see under the securities frameworks. But when it comes to decentralized protocols, this is like the underlying code or the underlying software. I think that we have a lot of work to do to think about what regulation in that space should look like. Because if you really just have code that's software out there on the internet and it's facilitating transactions, but it doesn't, ever take custody, right? It's just a tool for an end user to use, and they always maintain access to their funds, then I'm not sure that we need to have regulation around that space. I mean, I think there's some that are looking at the front end interfaces to those types of protocols as potentially being a point of regulation. Maybe there would be disclosures there, maybe there would be KYC information there, but I think that is a separate and distinct discussion from what we do with these centralized custodial intermediaries, those businesses that take customer funds and are acting on behalf of customers. That is clearly an appropriate place for regulation. And so, our thought at the Blockchain Association is it makes sense to tackle those known business models first and put in a regulatory framework around that. And then, at least from the US perspective, which is where I sit, we really like what our friends at the EU did of saying, let's take some time to understand the DeFi space and understand what these decentralized protocols are and how they work, because it is a space that's only been around for a very short amount of time. And it doesn't make sense necessarily to have that same kind of custodial regulation applied to DeFi. I think also on the project side, there are a lot of projects today. I mean, if you even look at Bitcoin, for example, people are like, oh, well, Bitcoin needs to register and provide disclosures. Well, who is Bitcoin, right? We don't know where Satoshi Nakamoto is. Like, there's no one company that's helping to, do the upkeep of the Bitcoin network. So the question is, who is the appropriate person to do those disclosures? And the answer might not be anyone that's dealing with the Bitcoin network. It might be the centralized platforms themselves that could provide some basic information on the state of the Bitcoin network. I just use that as an example. It could really apply to any of these as well. So yeah, I think it's important that decentralization is a concept that policymakers really truly need to kind of grasp their heads around before jumping forward, because if they move too quickly and try to apply regulations that have been made for these centralized intermediaries to decentralized protocols, it's like a square peg in a round hole. It's just not going to work. And it's going to make it very difficult for what I think is one of the most important parts of the innovation to continue to exist if we apply the wrong regulations.
I definitely agree with Kristin's point that more time is needed to understand DeFi, and that regulating without fully appreciating the nuances there could lead to issues that stifle different projects, different companies. And at the same time, we are ready to regulate centralized actors. I think there are good models out there for how to do that. And there are proposals in Congress that are pending now that hopefully will be reintroduced in the next Congress, get additional debate and attention and move forward so that we can at least close off on this piece of it.
Perfect. I think you guys both touched on a lot of information and really did a good job at answering that question. And I'm going to move on to another one from Florian, who says, do you think that utility will be the biggest factor in crypto in the future?
I think all regulators, with respect to the question that I hear the most when we talk to policymakers, is show us the use cases, show us how crypto can be utilized in a productive way that's not just about speculation. And I think that there are already cases out there demonstrating that. Ripple's products focus on the cross-border payment space. We use a crypto asset, XRP, to help facilitate and eliminate efficiencies in the current cross-border payment process. To me, the clearer the regulatory landscape, the more likely it is that we are going to continue to develop additional projects with utility. And to be clear, I think they are already out there, but it gets lost in the conversation to a certain extent when you have issues like FTX arise, because the conversation, as it should be, focuses on consumer protection. But crypto is much more diverse than that, involves many more players, many different projects. There are a lot of companies out there that are not consumer facing. And I think the sooner that we can build out that ecosystem, the sooner we can move away from this first phase where all of the attention, all of the heat and focus are on the blowups and the loss of consumer funds.
Yeah, no, I think I completely, sort of agree with what Sue said. I mean, it's the number one thing people want to know. Why is this stuff useful? This seems like merely a tool for speculation. And I think it's important to remember too, like where we are in the timeline of crypto assets. It's, been about 14 years since the launch of Bitcoin, and other assets didn't come along for a few years after that. And then, sort of in 2018, we saw quite a proliferation of many of these. And it's, if you think of that as you compare it to the trajectory of other industries, like this is the very, very early days, and it takes a while to build out these networks, to build applications on top of these networks. The adoption of these ideas takes time as well. And so, you really have to, I think, be mindful and, do research as you're looking at different assets to figure out, what are people building on this? Like, what are the problems that they're starting to solve? Is there a pathway for that to happen? So I think that, it's important to remember this is a very early time. It's, I think, a little bit like if you look at the internet, there were a lot of companies very early on that, aren't around today. And then, sort of new ones arise. So I think that, I just think that the utility will come over time because, we have these digital assets, they're scarce. They provide for the transfer and ownership of assets online. It's like a public or a private property right on the internet. Like we didn't have that before, digital assets. And so I think that there's a lot of economic activity that can happen. It's just going to take a little bit while for it to be something that people rely upon and use on every day. But I think there are a lot of good use cases out there that do get buried when you have the negative headlines that we've seen with FTX.
Yeah, I think you guys, again, did a great job tackling that question. And I definitely took a lot from it, and I hope the audience did as well. Another one that is coming in from Charles that I am curious of, because I think that the crypto community is probably one of the most educated investor communities. So how do they kind of advocate for any regulations that they might want to put into place or if they kind of see some regulation that they think that might not be helpful, how do we kind of raise that voice?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a couple steps, and Sue may have some ideas as well. I mean, I think the first thing is, if you're passionate about, crypto assets, digital assets, whatever you want to call them, I think number one, being informed about what's happening wherever you live, on the regulatory front is incredibly important, because there are moments where industry can, either weigh in with regulators, weigh in with their lawmakers. You can even weigh in with the courts in some instances, and tell the stories about why, what is being built and why this is important. And there are, if there's not a critical moment where there's something moving, then I think it's important to go in and do that basic education, because it is a complex space. And I think for policymakers that are trying to think about these things, it's not something that they can just have one conversation about and immediately make up their mind. It's a conversation they have to talk to many different people about, really explore all sides of it and understand this space better. So I think engaging with government, first staying informed to know when you have to engage, but then taking the time to get to know policymakers and engaging with them is important. In the United States, there are a lot of organizations that help facilitate that type of engagement. If you're with a company that's in this space, you can do things like join the Blockchain Association, but there are also advocacy groups that are supported by individuals like Coin Center or the DeFi Education Fund. It's sort of finding those that are providing this kind of information and tapping into it, and seeking their guidance for when the time is right to activate, because I think that this is something that we can get good policy outcomes when policymakers realize that so many people care about getting the outcomes done correctly.
I think Kristin is an expert in this area, and I think all the suggestions that she made are ones that I echo. I think the only things in addition to that, in addition to staying educated, there are government consultations globally in the space that are open to all. It's not just member companies that people can and should contribute to if they have something to say. And it is about making that direct engagement with the policymaker in your jurisdiction. If you live in a state, find out who your representatives are and make your voice heard. I think what's interesting too in the US is that crypto policy is happening at the federal level, but it's also very much a state issue. And there are laws that are being passed state by state that could affect different companies, different enterprises. It's on everyone. It's everyone's responsibility, I think, to educate themselves and get involved at whatever level they feel that they're most able to be effective.
Yeah. Thank you for answering that question. I'm sure Charles greatly appreciates it. And following a question from Steve, do you see that there could potentially be different regulation for proof of work versus proof of stake, or say Bitcoin versus the rest of crypto?
So
I'll let Sue go first. Go ahead.
I will just say that we don't think that there should be. I don't think the right line is Bitcoin versus the rest of crypto, and we should not be calling out specific tokens in legislation or creating that line for winners and losers. I think Congress is grappling with how do you define a digital asset commodity versus a digital asset security, and where that line falls will create the distinction that you're talking about between Bitcoin, which I think everyone acknowledges as a commodity, and what else belongs in that bucket. But the guiding line should be the definitions that we create. It should not be calling out specific tokens. And I think we're all hopeful that Congress in the next session is going to pick up these efforts and continue that debate. One point I think that has also come out that it's a little bit of a fallacy. This isn't a battle between the CFTC and the SEC. All of the bills in the United States, and this discussion is focused on the US specifically, carve out lines for both agencies. I think the point is having clear definitions, clear demarcations, because right now the guidance that's out there is the Howey test, which is a Supreme Court case from the 1940s that focuses on orange groves. The SEC, in an effort to help industries understand that test, has given them about 40 factors with no indication on how they should be weighed in order to determine how the test comes out. At one point, Commissioner Peirce compared it to a Jackson Pollock painting. That is not the type of clarity we need. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to Congress, and hopefully it is Congress and not the courts, which make that clear line between what's a security and what's a commodity.
Yeah, and I would add, I agree with everything Susan just said, but I think that what we have seen a little bit of in the United States, at least at the state level, is like New York has gone after like proof of work mining as being an inappropriate use of electricity or energy. And I think that, again, this is not, I don't think, we should be taking our sort of our energy and judging what is a good use or a bad use from a policy perspective. I think this is something that, the market, should decide. And if users want to go with blockchains that are more, electricity efficient, then they should be able to do that. Or if they, find value in Bitcoin, they should be able to do that as well, right? Like this shouldn't be something that policy decides. I think it should be something that the marketplace decides. And I agree completely on the security commodity definition. Like we should not be putting specific tokens like into law. Like that is just bad policy. And I think that, we want to provide a framework that can be applied in a clear way, but we shouldn't be calling out, specific assets over another.
Yeah, thank you. Great points on that answer as well. And one question that I kind of have for a follow-up from that is kind of understanding a little bit more of what do you think that the investors can do to kind of protect themselves until there is kind of a regulation framework? How can they spot and better pick coins and exchanges that are actually protecting them?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a couple ways to do it. I mean, one, you really have to, you have to do your own research. And the good news is, I think there are a lot of tools that are available out there. There's one organization called Vasari that puts out free reports every quarter on different token projects. But there are a lot of other like reputable sources online. I think the key is you have to understand that a token's like, value doesn't belong to any single company. It's really like who's building on that, what are the different activities, and where is it going in the future? And so you have to sort of understand like the appropriate framework for evaluating this. But I think it's incumbent upon investors to really better understand what it is they're investing in, and understand that this is a very sort of volatile and risky asset class. And if it's something you're looking to do for the short term, this might not be the right place for you. But I think, in the long run, this is a very interesting and exciting space. You just really have to do your own research before making any investment decisions.
Yeah.
I think doing your own research is the beginning and the end of the discussion. There is no single guidance that anyone can provide to tell you what is a good investment and what's not in this space right now. I think particularly given the lack of routine or customary disclosures and information about various projects. So it is on every investor has to do their own homework.
Yeah. So we touched on FTX a little bit earlier. Alessandro wants to know, do you think that FTX and subsequently the crypto exchange platforms fallout could boost the crypto space in the upcoming 5 to 10 years with some of the bad actors being removed? And then a follow-up question, do you think this crypto winter could be compared to the dot-com bubble in any way?
I think yes and yes. I think that, it's obviously very painful in the short term with everything that went on with FTX, but clearly this is a type of behavior and operation that we don't want to have in this industry. And so we want to weed out these bad actors sooner rather than later, because we're not going to be able to take off as an industry and an ecosystem until we get these types of people out. And so, yeah, as painful I think as it has been, from an investment perspective, but also from a policy and regulatory perspective, I think ultimately this will make the industry stronger, having these people gone and out of it, like undoubtedly. And so, yeah, I'm optimistic that we do have a bright future. And yeah, whether this crypto winter is exactly like the .com bubble, I think that's open to debate. But I do think that, sometimes, people get really excited when there's a new technology. It gets a little bit almost like, irrationally exuberant, I guess you could say. And that, we really have to kind of get back to like, all right, what is the real value here? What are the real projects? Let's not see crazy funding of all of these ideas that don't have any value and meaning. And I think it really like allows the best of the industry to come forward and an opportunity to shine. And if you can survive these difficult, sort of conditions, and then the projects and the companies in the space ultimately come out stronger. And if they're not strong and they don't have the right leadership in place, they don't have the right ideas, then they get weeded out. And that's kind of a natural sort of way to go about things. But yeah, I think it's definitely a common characteristic of any sort of, emerging technology that we need to be mindful of. And it's one of the reasons why you really do have to do your own research in this space, right? Because not everything is going to be a winner, not everything is going to survive. And so you want to be really careful about what you invest in.
I think I would also just add to that this is really, FTX is not a failure of crypto. It's a story about poor corporate governance and controls. And I think if what happens in the fallout from FTX is the enactment of better global regulatory frameworks that require centralized actors to register and close the loopholes just throughout the world in terms of how these sorts of actors operate, then we're in a better position than before the FTX debacle happened to begin with.
Yeah. Again, excellent answers to the question. So this one is from Javon. Susan, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Considering the collapse of Terra Luna and UST, do you think decentralized stablecoins can exist in the world of regulation?
I think that stablecoins that are, to me, the direction of regulation with respect to stablecoins is tipping towards fiat-backed stablecoins. What that actually looks like, both in the US and globally, I think is still to be determined, and the controls that will be imposed. But I do think that it is a number one priority for regulators here. I do think that we are going to see something, if not before the end of the year, which the window is closing, then definitely in the next Congress, that gets at stablecoins like USDC, which I think will be good for the ecosystem, and a good first step in terms of regulation. I think Kristin touched on this earlier, but I think the important part at this point is just we shouldn't be waiting until we have one holistic package to go through. Tackling some of these issues block by block and putting those regulations in place, I think, is absolutely the way to go. And stablecoins, I think, is at the top of the agenda for many policymakers.
Yeah, and I would also add, I think, a vast majority of stablecoins out there are these dollar-backed or reserve, currency-backed stablecoins, and that is a totally different beast than other types of stablecoins. And I would say there's almost, three categories. There's these fiat-backed stablecoins. There's what I would call decentralized but collateralized stablecoins. So these are things like DAI, where you have to lock up other digital assets in order to create a DAI token, and they're often over collateralized. Then you have sort of what we saw with the Terra Luna situation, where you have an algorithmic stablecoin where there is no collateral. And that is an incredibly different model. It's one that several people have tried. It's I can see why people want to pursue that goal. I mean, to be able to have stable value to share on the internet where you don't have to lock up other capital in order to have that, like that's sort of like the holy grail of stablecoins, right? The problem is people have tried it in a couple of different forms and it goes bust every time, because at the end of the day, you kind of have to have something backing that stable value. And so I think it's important, and this kind of goes back to our earlier conversation, that we separate these. If we have a centralized issuer of a fiat-backed stablecoin, there's a type of regulation that should be had. But when we're dealing with these, collateralized stablecoins that are all governed by smart contracts, that's kind of a different conversation, and one I think we need to understand a little bit better. And I think we should be focusing first on, what is 99% of the market, and looking separately and figuring out what is the role of these stablecoins ultimately going to be, and what are the risks there that need to be addressed. And it could be something around disclosures for investors, so they realize that they might not always be stable. It could be coming up with a different name for those types of things, so we're not using the term stablecoin to mean like 3 different things. And so I do think we have some work to do when it comes to the the quote unquote decentralized stablecoin space.
Thank you again for taking the time to answer that question. Packed full of gems, as always. And as we close out, I will say there's one more question that we probably have time to tackle from Omar. Who do you think will benefit the most from the UK Treasury's recent announcement that they are finalizing the package of regulatory rules for the crypto industry? And what do you think the implications on general crypto space would be?
So I think that the UK has earlier this year, and I think throughout, has made its intention to serve as a crypto hub pretty clear. And we applaud that. Ripple just issued a white paper where we put forward our thinking on what the regulatory framework should look like and what we think should happen in the UK. It starts with a finer distinction between the different types of crypto businesses. We think there need to be adequate resources for the agencies to do their job and coordination amongst them. I think all the moves that the UK government is making in terms of examining the space and potentially and giving the FCA authority to issue regulations is a good thing. I think that the folks there that are looking at this problem are looking for ways to build frameworks that protect consumers, promote innovation. And London, there was an article today that talked about the fact that London has just overtaken New York and San Francisco with respect to fintech investments. So I think that all signs are positive, and it's a plus for industry to have the UK enact a regulatory framework for actors going forward.
Perfect. Thank you, Susan. Kristin, do you have any thoughts you would like to add to that?
I'm less familiar with the details of what the UK did, but I agree with Susan. I think that this is a positive and a good step forward, and something that should be welcomed by, not like one sort of specific actor over another, but really the broader ecosystem.
Yeah, if you guys have nothing to add on that question, I think for the most part, we are wrapping up this session. And for everyone, stay tuned for the closing session of Day 1 Summit, How to Invest in the Metaverse, featuring Sebastian, the founder of Sandbox, and Esteban, founder of Decentraland. That's going to be a great one. You don't want to miss it. We've still got merch for the Finimize subscribers, and then also a free subscription. So make sure you are attending every session, and you may have the potential to win something throughout the day. When the little survey pops up, feel free to complete that. And without further ado, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for tuning in.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.